If you observe the biological brain at a microscopic level, you will not find a machine waiting quietly to be turned on. The nervous system never powers down, and it never resets to zero. It is a fluid, continuously active environment. For decades, early models of neural processing relied heavily on a strictly feed-forward sequence. As you can see in this standard network graph, data progresses linearly, moving from sensory input through intermediate layers to reach a final, distinct output. This classical model treats every sensory event as an isolated computational step. Once the sequence is complete, the system resets completely, waiting blankly for the next input to arrive. But the physical architecture of the cerebral cortex severely disrupts this model. Instead of one-way streets, the cortex is characterized by massive, ubiquitous recurrent connectivity. Information continuously loops back upon itself. Active neural populations instantly project signals back onto the exact populations that just stimulated them. These reciprocal pathways operate across multiple spatial and temporal scales, forcing us to rethink exactly how the brain handles data. Neural computation is therefore inherently recursive. It is history-dependent. Every new pattern of activation becomes part of the baseline condition that will influence all future activity. Biological computation defies the concept of discrete computational steps. It must be analyzed as a continuously evolving dynamic landscape. To see how this landscape functions in reality, we have to isolate a microscopic circuit and observe how local populations of neurons interact when a stimulus arrives. This diagram illustrates recurrent excitation. When a stimulus strikes the network, active neurons stimulate neighbors, who project axons back onto the original population. Notice what happens when external input stops. The internal looping signals cycle. The pattern reinforces itself, resisting immediate decay. At a macro level, this microcircuit persistence is the foundation of working memory. It is the literal biological mechanism of holding a thought. Sustaining this coherent activity is also the biological prerequisite for preparing a physical movement or engaging in an extended decision-making process. It allows the brain to hold and manipulate a representation even when the physical sensory object is no longer in front of you. The persistence of a memory does not require a continuous feed from external reality. It emerges entirely from the internal architectural dynamics of the neural population itself. A system built purely on recurrent excitation has a catastrophic structural flaw. Left alone, these self-reinforcing loops would infinitely amplify, resulting in runaway systemic instability. Biological systems solve this through a strict counterweight, inhibitory interneurons. These interneurons receive input from the excitatory population and immediately fire back. They send suppressing signals directly into the same population that triggered them, returning the cluster to a controlled baseline. This precise feedback mechanism prevents chaotic overstimulation while actively sharpening neural responses. It's suppressive competing surrounding populations, forcing clear signal separation. The result is a neural system that continuously regulates its own activity through reciprocal excitation and inhibition. This ongoing balance between amplification and suppression is known as dynamic equilibrium. Stable neural computation is therefore never a state of passive rest. It is a highly active, regulated tug-of-war that forces alternative representations to constantly compete for dominance. These dynamics are not limited to local microcircuits. They define the macroarchitecture of the entire cerebral cortex. In this hierarchical map of the brain, we can trace the scale of recurrent connectivity. While sensory information naturally flows upward, higher-order cortical regions simultaneously project massive neural pathways downward, back toward early sensory areas. When complex cognitive processing flows downward and collides with early sensory data, it physically alters how that basic information is being perceived in real time. Perception relies on a continuous physical interaction between top-down expectations and bottom-up data, negating the idea of a simple one-way progression from sensation to recognition. This recurrent structure extends entirely beyond the cortex, forming massive feedback loops with subcortical structures like the thalamus and the basal ganglia. Ultimately, the nervous system operates through nested, continuous feedback loops, reaching down through the spinal cord, autonomic nervous system, and into the external environment. The environment is physically part of the circuit. Your movements alter what your sensory organs can perceive. Those modified sensory inputs then alter the brain's internal neural activity. That updated neural activity immediately alters your subsequent physical movements, while constantly modifying the body's internal physiological state. Because the brain, body, and environment are locked in these continuously nested cyclical interactions, treating biological computation as an isolated chain of events is biologically invalid. When you combine all these nested excitatory and inhibitory loops, a systemic phenomenon emerges, described as attractor dynamics. Look at this topological energy landscape. Out of millions of potentially chaotic neural configurations, only certain highly organized patterns remain stable over time. The network naturally settles into these stable configurations. These organized patterns act as magnetic resting states, pulling the system's chaotic activity into a unified structure. When minor sensory perturbations occur, the system relies on this internal gravity. It predictably pulls the network's activity right back toward the center of the stable configuration. But when circumstances radically change, the existing stable configuration dissolves. The system transitions over the ridge, finding an entirely new stable configuration. This abstract geometry maps directly onto actual cognition. Attractor dynamics provide the proposed mechanism for how we reliably retrieve our past memories, maintain perceptual stability, and hold a motor plan. Attractor basins provide the required biological substrate. They allow neural populations to temporarily lock in coherent representations while remaining entirely flexible to new environments. The inescapable reality of biological wetware is that the nervous system never resets between stimuli. Every single moment of neural processing strictly inherits the residual synaptic traces, membrane potentials, and recurrent activity of the exact microsecond that preceded it. At any given instant, a neural network's physical state is an inseparable combination of incoming sensory data and the accumulated momentum of its own history. Everything we have just covered regarding recurrent connectivity, inhibition, and attractor states is firmly established, widely accepted neuroscience. This brings us to the theoretical boundary and the introduction of tokenization theory, an explanatory framework that attempts to solve how higher-order cognitive structures emerge from these precise biological dynamics. It is critical to draw a strict line here. Attractor states and recurrent loops are not tokens themselves, nor do they automatically generate tokens. The mere presence of recursive network activity does not directly prove the existence of tokenization theory, nor does it automatically establish relevance realization. The relationship is foundational. Established dynamical principles provide the required biological hardware. The theoretical challenge moving forward is determining if those physical principles can actually support the complex architecture of tokenization theory.